Wickiups were a shelter for the Ute people. They were trees that were taken from the land that we could find. One Wickiup will not look like the next because there's different trees.
We've been recording Wickiups for many years.
We're down to the last few hundred of them on the surface of the western United States. And that's why we're in a kind of a rush against time.
So we try very hard not to leave anything behind, which sometimes provides a challenge for the archaeological community to record and find evidence.
The fact that they weren't well recorded or understood made them seem even more significant.
The Ute people virtually lost all of Colorado. In our minds, our old Ute territory, we still own that land. Beneath that is where our ancestral people are buried. So that's why we want to keep them and preserve them as much as possible.
This program was made possible by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
with support from the Denver Public Library, History Colorado, and the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media, with additional support from these organizations and viewers like you. Thank you.
A Wickiup is an anthropological or archaeological name that has been used for Native American dwellings. Our homes. We prefer to call it Ute dwellings or Ute lodges rather than a Wickiup.
Wickiups were a shelter for the people, and they were, relatively speaking, not fresh green cut trees, but rather trees that were taken from the land that we could find, and we were very, very resourceful in finding what was offered to us, not intentionally going and chopping new stuff.
It's a brush shelter, the shape and design and size of which is at least partially predicated by the environment, what the environment gives you to build a shelter out of. Here in the pinyon juniper habitat of western Colorado, you break off dead saplings or branches of primarily juniper trees. 97% of our wooden feature poles for the platforms in the Wickiups are juniper as opposed to pinyon.
In the summertime, they're up in the mountains. They're building lodges there. So they make lodges that are easier to put together. Sometimes they're made out of aspen poles, especially in the mountains where there's aspen, a lot of aspen. So they're dwelling out of aspen poles.
What Mother Earth provides to us is all to be seen. We don't go seeking it. It's usually there for us. And so it's through that knowledge and the ability to structure something in a unique form to provide that shelter. One Wickiup will not look like the next, because there's different trees, different brush that are out there.
They're so expedient, some are bigger than others, some leaned one direction or the other, but they were put together with the weather in mind more than anything else. We spend a whole lot more time recording it than they did building it. A whole lot more time, which is ironic.
The real reason I started for Dominguez Archaeological Research Group was because years of being in the field and finding sites being wiped out by vandals and animals and development of all sorts. And that's part of what the Wickiup project was all about. Those things are in the environment, and wood deteriorates, and a lot of these were done probably 150 years ago, and ultimately they go into the ground. We've been recording Wickiups for for many years, actually, from the 1980s when we first started doing cultural resource management work. But the Colorado Preservation Organization listed this as one of the most endangered structures in Colorado. And so we picked up on that to push the Wickiup project.
Back in 2003, DARG got a small grant to do a Wickiup study in a site in Garfield County, which is one of the largest accumulations of Wickiup structures. It was kind of astounding to learn how little we knew about Ute archaeology, even though it's the most recent indigenous and aboriginal archaeology available to us. The fact that they weren't well recorded or understood made them seem even more significant.
We tread very lightly, and we're told you leave the campsite as though you were never there. So we try very hard not to leave anything behind, which sometimes provides a challenge for the archaeological community. They're looking for evidence. We're told do not leave, basically in English, do not leave evidence you were there.
Even though the Utes were gone, they had left these traces of their hunter-gatherer lifestyle here. How little we actually knew and how hard they were to recognize out in the field, which is also why they weren't studied well. It quickly became obvious that we didn't know enough to actually interpret the meaning of these or the significance of them even without starting to talk to the Utes.
The knowledge that I carry is basically very much in contrast to the archaeological community. With archaeological education, people go to school for years, they learn processes to collect data, interpret that, and then try to tell a story according to how the data tells this story per the collection of evidence and science. But as Indigenous people, we actually have what's called traditional knowledge. A lot of that knowledge and the stories are handed down from generation to generation. It's a process of recounting events, but they're all told by someone who has a heartbeat, who has the ability to draw air. So for us, those stories are very much alive. We never question it. That's one of the things as a young person when listening to elders tell these stories, you never question. Out of respect, you listen.
As archaeologists, we're always asked a couple of questions. What did you find? And what did you find out? And so we try to answer those basic questions of what did you find by doing intensive recording, gathering data, putting it into a sort of book of facts. We're tracking all of these sites on the landscape, and they extend from these sites that we've been recording, extend from the Uncompahgre clear up through the Piceance Basin. In fact, the Piceance Basin has some of the best preserved Wickiup villages and just single Wickiups that we've recorded. Security was a major issue for site location. Most often, sites are located on hilltops, high points along ridges. They wanted water and food resources to be fairly close.
So that's where you would always find the people having their encampments near a water source. When you speak to an Indigenous person and you say natural resources, we're always going to say water, land, plants, animals, things that are more natural in the state of where we've always conducted life.
It's pretty clear that these people traveled in extended family groups, and a lot of the Wickiup villages were ranged by family groups.
You might just have three families, so there may be only evidence of a smaller group of Wickiups or lodges where they may have lived. It just depended on what activity they may have been engaged in per the season. And then we, at different points, would congregate back together and we would share whatever the harvest we may have been. Maybe one group of people collected a lot of berries. Maybe one people were able to to harvest a lot of hunting the game and bringing the meat in.
They always had a landmark, or they had a place that the women knew, this is my campsite. So they would look for that rock. That rock, when you turn it over, is a matate. So they use matates. It's a grinding stone. And when they turned it over, that was their matate. So they said, this is where I camped last year, or year before, or 2 years ago.
We're being led to these sites where there are extant wooden features, these expedient little wooden features like Wickiups that the Ute people made. And since they don't last too long, we're being led to sites that are no more than 200, 300, 400 years old at most. And as a result, over half of our sites have trade goods, metal and glass artifacts, as a result of the Spanish in the area. They had this bounty of goods and trade items, but it was ephemeral, it was short-lived. It came with a price, the price of freedom. It's easy when you're out there in the field doing your field work to get engrossed in the minutiae, the details of mapping the artifacts in place, measuring the Wickiup poles, getting all this data because these things are going away so rapidly. But then every once in a while there's some little thing that brings us back to the fact that we're out there. What this is really about is the people who live there. I know on this one site, the Ute Hunters Camp, we called it, because they were, one of the main activities on the site was making lead bullets, smelting the lead over the campfire. And we carefully mapped where all these little bullet primers were that they popped out of the bullet casings. And you could see where the individual knocking these primers out had been kneeling. The bullets were arranged in 2 arcs where his knees had been. We've gotten to the point now where we can walk onto one of these Wickiup sites and start finding seed beads. We can tell from the size of these beads, this is pre-1860s, this is 1850s, or this is post-1880s, 1890s. They were demanding and requesting smaller and smaller and smaller beads because they could make more and more intricate embroidery with these beads. And these beads were made primarily in Venice, Italy, and in Bohemia, or in Europe, and shipped over the ocean by the hundreds of pounds. Billions, literally billions of these little beads were shipped over to the East Coast, brought out west on some trader's mule, and traded to the Indians by the billions, where they were sewn onto their clothing, their moccasins, their gun scabbards, horse blankets, etc. And when a thread breaks, dozens of these little things will fall out onto the ground, and many, many of them were left behind. But it brings it back to the fact there were people here, not just artifacts. That's that, right there. There's 13.
I really, really believe that the archaeological community needs to come down to the level of they are not the almighty authority. The people who've lived the life should be revered as the almighty authority.
During the early period, we were required to collect artifacts, and the Utes were kind of against that idea.
The invasive archaeological digs was one of the things that we felt was invading the resting places of those who have passed on.
Science is all about the collection of data, not actually the collection of artifacts. However, the past has been very good. That record, that collected record from thousands of sites, literally thousands of sites have been recorded in western Colorado, tens of thousands. The record is being preserved one way or another, but hopefully it's going to be preserved more through data than collection in the future.
There's so many different innovations out there that will take a lot of the processes and allow them to not be so invasive.
As early as the early 17th centuries, 1600, 1610, Santa Fe and Taos, when the Spaniards arrived, the native peoples, including the Utes, were gaining access to these trade goods. Metal knives, metal axes. Once you had a metal axe, tree trunks and tree limbs became a source for your wooden feature elements. They could go through a juniper or pinyon sapling or branch in a matter of seconds, which they could not do prior to having metal axes. Once they were taking at least some of their Wickiup poles or platform beams with metal axes, we're able to date that structure using dendrochronology or tree ring dating. The prehistoric weather patterns are reflected in a cross section or a core from one of these trees. And dendrochronologists who do tree ring dating have established sequences that vary from area to area. They establish these sequences of thick and thin rings, and they begin to recognize those. And if you've got the outer ring or the bark, they can tell you not only the year that that tree was cut down, but sometimes the season of the year. We had one site, the Pisgah site up in Eagle County. We took 20-some dendrochronology samples, again and again and again and again. It was the fall and winter of 1853. We know exactly when those people were living there, which is pretty unusual for archaeologists, to be able to pin it down that close.
This is the earliest tree ring date we've ever got.
Our earliest good, solid date from tree ring dating is out here on the Uncompahgre Plateau, is 1795. We got a standing Wickiup, and we cored one of the axe-cut poles, and the outer ring was 1795. People have been building these brush shelters for 12,000 years. In a shelter, in an overhang, or a cave of some kind, they might be 1,000 years old. Out in the open, I doubt any of them much prior to 1750 are out there, but we're just guessing.
As our grandparents have said, the great mystery sometimes is there for a reason. It's not for you to figure out. Just know that it does exist.
The Ute people virtually lost all of Colorado, what had been one time their land, because of greed, because of manipulation of peoples, of what they wanted, you know, wealth and all that. So by 1868, they had established what they call the Ute Reservation in 1/3 of Colorado. They established that for all the Utes. It would be their land forever as long as the grass grows and the water flows. And that's one of the famous statements that the government has made with most treaties. But immigrants coming into those areas, finding rich in resources, rich in minerals, invaded into the Ute Reservation. It was greed. In our minds, these places of our old Ute territory, we still own that land. White man only owns a foot of it. Beneath that is where our ancestral people are buried. You walk upon our ancestral bones.
We were all taught in school, Ute archaeology in Colorado ends in 1881. The gold and silver seekers were here, the Front Range was getting populated, agricultural lands were being discovered in western Colorado, and the call of the Utes must go rang out. But over half of our sites in northwest and west central Colorado are after 1882. There were still plenty of Utes in Colorado living on the landscape, much as they had for thousands of years. We've got a Wickiup site that dates to 1914. We got one in 1916. They were undoubtedly Utes living on the landscape under the radar in western Colorado into the 1920s. You don't see that in the history books. After 1881 in Colorado, they were basically saying, you're red, you're dead. So they were moving, instead of being at the springs and along the rivers and water courses and along the trails and corridors, they were going under the radar. Their settlement patterns changed. They were living in less attractive places to live to avoid contact with the white settlers and miners and cavalry. It's funny as an archaeologist. As an archaeologist, we spend our careers looking for the earliest example of something, the oldest, that we get excited about the most recent find we can find. 1916, how great is that?
They came back, hunted in the old hunting areas, stayed in the old places that their families used and people used to stay at. They made that. It may have become government land, it may have become private land and things like that, but they moved back into those areas.
The creation story I grew up with was we were made in the mountains, and that's where the Creator had left us.
We don't have no migration story. I've asked a lot of the elders, where did we come from? They had no answer. They said, we've always been here.
We were there to partake of the land, and for the trees, the animals, the birds, they were going to be the ones who would teach us how to live this life out here.
They made temporary shelters. So you find some of these temporary shelters along where they were either hunting or if they were visiting other Ute bands. When that season starts to change, then they're starting to move back down into warmer areas. But those lodges are still there. The following year, they're moving back up to the same area. So those lodges are there. And a lot of the hunting lodges that they made are still there also, because they're going to eventually come back and they're going to use that.
With the Wickiup project, most of the understanding comes through material culture, because that's sort of the hallmark of our own technological society, our property-based rather than place-based society. Places are seen as property, which is a thing, but for Aboriginal cultures generally, and certainly for the Utes as I've come to understand them, place is a living thing, and it's a way of life, not something that's owned.
That was once somebody's home. Would I ever walk into George Washington's former home and just start ramrodding it? No, I don't think so. Well, that's the same thing as if you were going into a Wickiup. That was somebody's home. That was where somebody conducted life or duty in that time. Our grandparents would say, be careful what you touch and what you do, because even if that person does not exist in this life anymore, that does not mean they may not want what you took. That doesn't belong to you.
It's a physical world that we're looking at, but they may have been looking, and probably were looking at, more of a spiritual world as well.
Wickiups to us is used by our ancestors that lived in that area. Maybe they had a certain spirituality. That's where we call it significant to us. It may not be significant to anybody else, but to us it is significant. That's why we want archaeologists to preserve it.
We feel like the Wickiup project has been a big success, at least from our point of view, and I think the Utes respect and value what we've done to some degree. We've always felt that what we were doing was for the benefit of the tribes as well as our own scientific interest as archaeologists. It's not just science, it's cultural preservation, heritage.
It gives us a sense of groundedness because it's still there, that we know that our ancestors lived in that area. So that gives us evidence that we can say, yes, my people lived here because of the structures. To us, that is significant because it gives us a sense that our people were there and there isn't anybody that can dispute that.